Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's roundtable on Ancient Women Philosophers. I'm Diane Enns. I'm a professor of philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University and the director of the Society for Women of Ideas. So the society, we started it a year ago with some of my colleagues and friends. The purpose is to feature to focus on the neglected work of women philosophers in various historical periods, but also to focus on interdisciplinary women thinkers. So we really wanted to start a public forum dedicated to promoting the work of women thinkers across the disciplines. This particular event is the first in our new series called A Mind of Her Own. And this is the series where we want to focus on historical time periods. So we'll probably have another one in the winter semester. Please always check our website for updates. I'm going to guide the discussion around our imaginary table with our 5 guests for about an hour, give or take 10 minutes. And then I'll open it up to general questions and comments from the audience. I won't, the chat will be disabled until we get to the general Q&A. I'm very delighted to introduce our 5 guests. They're all experts on ancient philosophy, and they've all contributed to a collected volume of essays that's forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. It's called Ancient Women Philosophers, Recovered Ideas and New Perspectives. The editors, who are both here with us, are going to say a little bit more about this volume. But first, I will introduce our speakers. Their full bios are on the site, so I won't repeat those. I will just give the abbreviated versions. Brian Black is here. He's the senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Religion at Lancaster University. Anna Christensen is the assistant professor of philosophy at Central College in Pellò, Iowa. Katharine O'Reilly is assistant professor of philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. Caterina Pellò is a teaching associate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Nottingham. And Rosemary Twomey is an assistant professor at Queen's College, City University of New York. So I'll turn it over to you, Katharine and Caterina, to say a few words about your marvelous project.
Great, thanks, Diane, and a big thanks to you and your SWI collaborators for hosting this event and inviting us to speak, and to our fellow contributors, panelists, for coming on board today on a Friday. So I guess it's worth saying something about the project that unites us as panelists. So I expect that our discussion will touch on issues that are of interest for thinking about ancient women philosophers much more broadly than just this project. But to say something about the book. So it's a book about the earliest women philosophers in our evidence in a number of traditions, about their breakthroughs, their philosophical ideas, and the methods that we can use to recover and restore those to the philosophical canon. So those are the aims of the volume. And what that looks like is a collection of 12 essays, which each focus on the philosophical ideas of a women philosopher or a group of women philosophers, and demonstrate both the outcomes and the limits of the latest research. So each of these chapters takes up methodological questions to offer a sort of full discussion, a profitable discussion of the source strategies that one might use to approach the available evidence and the challenges that are built into that. Caterina and myself offer an introduction which picks up on that methodological focus, looking across the treatments to make some general claims. And there we argue that the challenges posed by this material are rewarded by enhancing the history of philosophy generally, both by restoring lost voices and lost ideas, and by enriching our engagement with kind of metaphilosophical questions about what philosophy is and what it can and ought to be. So I'll share the table of contents with you just to give you a sense of the chapter breakdown. And maybe while I do that, Caterina, would you mind like speaking to the table of contents, to the chapters a little bit?
Yes. So thank you, Kate, and again, thank you very much, Diane, and to the SWI for organizing this and inviting us. So very briefly, these are the 12 chapters of our edited volume, Ancient Women Philosophers. As Katharine mentioned, each chapter revolves around either a woman philosopher or a group of philosophers, and what we asked our contributors to do was to focus on two aspects mainly. First of all, the sources. So in each case, what is our evidence? What sources do we have available, and how do we approach them? So from a more methodological point of view, how can we work around the difficulties of the sort of limited sources for ancient women philosophers? And the second question we had was, what are these women's ideas? And so what are their contributions to the history of philosophy? And so both aspects are highlighted in different ways in the individual chapters. So very briefly, we have some of the contributors here today, and they will be able to tell you much more about their chapters, and we'll make examples throughout the roundtable. But very briefly, the chapters are organized chronologically, and we start with the more general question of whether philosophical activity in antiquity was considered to be gendered or genderless, so whether there was a female specific way of doing philosophy in antiquity. And what I like about the first two chapters, the first by Frisby Sheffield and the second by Brian Black, who's here, is that they answer this sort of similar question based on two case studies for two different traditions. So we have Diotima from the Greek tradition and Sulabha from the Indian tradition. So most of you, some of you may be already familiar with Diotima. So we know we meet Diotima in Plato's Symposium, in a dialogue by Plato titled The Symposium, and she's introduced as the teacher of Socrates. And when it comes to this figure, there are sort of two main questions that scholars have asked. First of all, whether she was real, whether she really existed. And second, why Plato chooses to ascribe his sort of metaphysical arguments in the Symposium to a woman philosopher. So the way Frisby answers this question is that the very reason why Diotima is in the Symposium is to show that philosophy for Plato was considered to be a genderless activity, something that both men and women could do. I won't say much about Brian's chapter because he's here and he will do that better than I can. But in his chapter, again, he looks at a specific episode in the Mahabharata, which is the dialogue between Sulabha, the woman philosopher, and King Janaka. And again, he doesn't focus on whether or not Sulabha is a historical woman philosopher, but he does focus on the content of the dialogue and whether gender is considered to have, or whether gender has or doesn't have an impact on intellectual activity and philosophical activity, and how ultimately philosophical activity appears to be beyond gender distinction. We have then one chapter on female physicians in Greek antiquity. So Sophia Connell writes a book focusing on the Hippocratic medical corpus. And again, there has been much literature on how in Greek antiquity, ancient philosophy and ancient medicine were connected. What Sophia does is that she looks through the Hippocratic corpus, finding evidence of women practicing medicine and theorizing about medicine, theorizing about the human body. And she argues that in the same way as we considered male physician to be sort of philosophically valuable in Greek antiquity, so we should do for female physicians. We then have we then move on to the Hellenistic period, and we have 3 chapters on women in the main 3 of the most important Hellenistic schools. Epicurean women, a chapter is written by Kelly Aronson. Women in Arete, so women in the Cyrenaics, and this chapter is written by Katharine O'Reilly, and again, she will tell you more about it later. And finally, we have a chapter on Stoic women, and written by Kate Brassel. And what's interesting about Stoic women is that, again, we have very limited evidence about real life Stoic women philosophers. So what Kate does in her chapter is to look at literary material, tragedies, specifically Seneca's tragedy, and see whether the female characters in the tragedies can tell us anything about real life Stoic women philosophers. Then we have 2 chapters on the Pythagorean women, which is sort of the only surviving case of sort of texts written in Greek antiquity and ascribed to women philosophers. We have 2 groups of texts, one more focused on family life and marriage, and Rosemary Twomey deals with this group of texts in her chapter. And then we have some treatises that are more sort of metaphysical, epistemological, and in a chapter that I co-wrote with Giulia De Cesaris, we analyze one by ascribed to an author named Perizione. Then we sort of move on to late antiquity, and we have Anna Christensen's chapter on Macrina, who's the sister of Gregory of Nyssa, and she analyzes the dialogue between Gregory and Macrina concerning the nature and the immortality of the soul. We have a chapter on Neoplatonist women philosophers, Hypatia and Sosipatra, written by Jana Schulz. Again, no writings have survived by these 2 women, but they were philosophers. They were teachers in philosophical schools. And so Jana tries to see what we can find out about them and their ideas. And in conclusion, we have 1 chapter on Ban Zhao, who's a Chinese woman philosopher, a Confucian philosopher, who wrote about female education. And what Anne Pang Wright tries to do in her chapter is to approach her texts not from a literary point of view, but from a philosophical point of view. And in conclusion, a chapter by Peter Adamson that looks at the reception of Plato's arguments about women philosophers in different traditions, the Neoplatonist Proclus, the Islamic philosophers Ibn Rashid, Averroes in the 12th century, all the way to sort of early modern philosophers, Lucrezia Marinella in the 16th century. So sort of we go all the way to the very beginning of feminist philosophy in a sense. But we'll see more specific, particular examples later.
Thanks very much, Katharine and Caterina, for that introduction to your volume. Now, to start the discussion, I would like to ask each of you to say a little bit about the woman or women who are featured in your contributions, and tell us why they captured your interest, because they certainly captured my interest when I was reading. I did not know much about any of these women. As a non-specialist, I found this one of the most fascinating aspects of the manuscript. So I think this is a good place to start. Tell us about the women you wrote about. Maybe we can do it in the order that you come in the book. So Brian, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. My chapter is about Sulaba, and Sulaba she's a philosopher, but also a female renouncer and ascetic. So in other words, she's a religious wanderer. She's depicted as learned in Indian philosophy, although it's not exactly clear which philosophical school she's affiliated with. She's achieved moksha, which means that she's considered to be liberated or enlightened. This means that she's achieved the highest knowledge, which implies control over her thoughts and actions, and also that she's released from the karmic cycle of rebirth. She's also described as an adept of yoga. Implicitly, she has achieved moksha through this practice of yoga. Sulaba appears in a text called the Mahabharata, which was originally composed in India. Scholars debate about when it actually was composed. It's one of the longest books in the world and is said to have it consists of about 1.8 million words. This is her only appearance in this text, so it's a long it's an extended scene in which she appears and she gives a detailed argument that is perhaps more philosophical than a lot of the other material in the Mahabharata, which is a combination of myth and narrative and a number of other things. So in one sense, she's sort of an anomaly because she only appears in that one text. and she's one of the few kind of explicitly female philosophical figures in the text. But then on the other hand, there are a lot of female characters who are quite prominent in the text and who are perhaps not depicted as or characterized as philosophers, but then who make important contributions to debates about things like dharma, which can be translated as morality and justice and a whole number of other things. So in that way, I think that although in some ways she's sort of a lone female voice, in other ways she's not. She contributes to a number of prominent female voices in the text. And just to quickly address what captured my imagination, well, there are really two things. I first became interested in Sulabha because she appears in a scene that is kind of similar to scenes that appear in the Upanishads, which are a group of earlier texts and considered the sort of first philosophical texts of ancient India. So I love the dialogue form, the exchange between the characters. It was also very exciting to meet a female character who was making such, progressive arguments about gender. And then also I love the magical realism of the scene. She's an adept of yoga. She can transform what she looks like. She uses her yogic power to enter into the body of Janaka. And I just think it's a wonderful scene. And it still captures my imagination 20 years later.
Thank you, Brian. Katharine.
Thank you. I still love hearing about that. It's amazing. So my chapter is on Arete of Cyrene, who is a member of the Cyrenaic school, one of the Hellenistic schools, and she flourished around 350 BCE. So to contextualize that, her father, whose name was Aristippus the Elder, was in Plato's generation and was, like Plato, a companion of Socrates, and she's in the generation after that, so alongside people like Aristotle. She's part of the Cyrenaics, and they're the kind of ultra hedonists of the ancient world. So they believed in taking pleasure from any source that you can find it, and particularly pleasure of the moment and bodily pleasures. So they're much more extreme than the Epicureans. And I do other work on Hellenistic theories of pleasure and pain in general. So that's part of why I came to work on Arete. Her school is founded by her father, Aristippus the Elder, and he's this kind of public intellectual who's known for living and performing his philosophical commitments, which was not unusual at the time, in ways that are preserved in doxographical accounts, which are likely exaggerated and are very fun to read, but sometimes difficult to deal with as source material because of the exaggeration. And then he chose his daughter as his philosophical successor, and he brought her into the school to carry on his intellectual legacy and eventually to act as head of the school and to teach her son, who's famous for making the central doctrines of the school formalized, whereas they were really informal previous to that. And his name is Aristippus the Younger. So as I said, I've worked on the Cyrenaics previously, but the thing that caught my attention about Arete is that I didn't know anything else about her, but I did know that her son had this nickname, Maître Didactos, which means mother taught. And I was always curious about this famous tag, like how this was intended, why, is it pejorative? Why would someone be keen to emphasize that they were mother taught? This isn't a particular point of honor generally in Greek culture at the time. Why would he want to be, or why do someone who names him that, why do they want to emphasize the pedagogic role of the mother? And as I argue in the chapter, I think that this is done to establish and emphasize continuity for the school from the founder to the codifier, with this direct intellectual succession from Socrates through, the father, the mother teacher, and then the mother taught son. And the Cyrenaics put a lot of weight on their status as a Socratic offshoot. But the result of that is that Arete's independent philosophical ideas and contributions are really suppressed in the sources that we have in favor of emphasis on her role in this philosophical lineage. So my other aim in the chapter is to see what can be discovered about her role and what I can establish to include her separate from but alongside her father and son, as playing this independent philosophical role in the Cyrenaics of the period. So that's what I tried to do.
Thank you, Katharine. Rosemary.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this as well. So my chapter is on some Pythagorean women philosophers. I focus on 3 texts in particular. So Pythagoras is a philosopher in the 6th century, 5th century BCE. He doesn't leave any writings, but he's purported to have like a close relationship with his wife, his daughter. His wife was said to be a philosopher to some extent. He left his work to his daughter. We lost it. So, but supposedly she refused to sell it even when she needed the money. So he had worked closely with women. He was known or supposedly proselytized among women. Pythagoras, in addition to being a philosopher, had a kind of cult around him. They lived communally and shared property. And so that would require, obviously, the participation not just of the men in the community, but also the women. So we get these later documents. Initially, we hear about Pythagorean women in Diogenes, in Iamblichus, in Porphyry. In Iamblichus, he gives us a list, 17 women, and he just says this is like the most prominent Pythagoreans. There are 235 overall, 17 of them are women. So there's a myriad texts. Some of them are quite obviously philosophical. The one Caterina and her co-author works on. There's also some works in musical theory by a woman named Ptolemaeus. But I wanted to focus on some of the texts that are about the running of the household and domestic issues, which, as I say, would loom large for Pythagorean culture. The texts themselves are certainly not from Pythagoras's time. Some people date them around, say, a little bit after Aristotle, but more likely it's close to 1st century BCE to 1st century CE. And in that case, the letters are written and also the treatises to sound like they're older. They have antiquated language in them, and they're written often in the names of prominent Pythagorean women. So one of the texts I talk about is supposedly written by Theano, who that's the name of Pythagoras's wife. There are several texts by Perictione. Caterina and her co-author talk about one. I talk about another one. They're certainly not the same person because they're written in different dialects. But she was, presumably that's supposed to be a reference to the mother of Plato, who has the same name and is a descendant of Solon and was said to have some philosophical leanings herself. So I look at these texts. I don't know, clearly there's some misleading going on here. They're made to sound older than they are, and using these famous names probably gives them a rubber stamp that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So there's many people who think they might have been written by men. But the important thing to me, that what really drove me to the text, was that they're clearly written for women, to influence women. And so a lot of these other texts that we're looking at are, maybe you might say, general philosophical interest, or written specifically for consumption by presumably almost entirely men. Whereas these texts, whoever wrote them, are written to appeal to women. And as I argue in my article, do have philosophical themes in them, philosophical stylings, and can be usefully compared to other texts about the household, where those texts, like Aristotle's Politics, for instance, are written from the standpoint of the head of the household, rather than other members of the household. So yeah, I guess what I found really interesting about their work was both, that there's not very much to look at in the first place. So if you're looking to find something of value that is extant, that's supposed to be written by women who are arguably philosophers, then these are good texts to look at, but also because of the orientation of them towards a female audience as well.
Thanks, Rosemary. Caterina, you're next.
Thank you. So again, I work on the same corpus, on the same group of texts as Rosemary, the sort of this pseudo-epigraphic material ascribed to Pythagorean women. But specifically, I focus on, in the chapter I wrote together with Giulia De Cesaris, we focus on one specific treatise titled On Wisdom, and ascribed to an arguably Pythagorean woman named Perictione. So I guess we know two things about Perictione. First of all, we know that this was the name of Plato's mother. And second, we know that, as Rosemary said, roughly around the 1st century BCE, we find these treatises, well, a couple of treatises actually, written under her name. Now, I'll say a bit more about the content of the treatise, but very briefly, the source problem, the source issue I deal with. So I mentioned, and Rosemary deals with in a sense, I mentioned that the text was arguably written around the 1st century BCE. So it couldn't possibly be the work of Plato's mother, who lived much earlier. So we know that this text was written by someone else under the name, either someone who was named after Plato's mother, perhaps, but most likely someone who was using a pseudonym, the name of Plato's mother as pseudonym. So the issue in the scholarship is that the fact that we don't know who wrote this text led scholars to question whether it could have in fact be written by a woman in the first place. So perhaps it was not even a woman writing the text, but a man using a female pseudonym, and specifically the pseudonym, the name of Plato's mother. And because of that, this authorship issue, in the case of On Wisdom and in the case of the text Rosemary works on, has acted sort of like a barrier for scholars to really engage with the content of the treatise. Now, on the one hand, my job is slightly easier than those of most of the contributors in the volume because I have a text. It's also slightly easier than Rosemary because my text deals with metaphysics and epistemology. So these are sort of straight topics that are traditionally considered philosophical. And yet what was puzzling is that these texts, not many people have a look at these treatises and read these fragments or engage with it. So very briefly, the text revolves around the question of what philosophy is about and why we should pursue it. And Perictione makes sort of three claims. First of all, she says that the very purpose of human beings, not women, human beings in general, is the contemplation of all things that are, and that wisdom, philosophy, is that which enables us to do so. Second, she says that philosophy is higher ranked than all other theoretical activities, all other sciences, natural sciences, physics, mathematics, harmonics, precisely because philosophy is about all things that are rather than most things, natural things, numbers, or particular things. And in the conclusions, she said that we should dedicate ourselves to the pursuit of philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom, because philosophy brings us closer to the divine. Now, what got me interested in this text to begin with, I've never really worked on ancient metaphysics. So I got to this text because I was working on the Pythagorean women. And then I stumbled across a text that was not about home economics. It was not about family life. It was about cosmology. It was about epistemology, metaphysics. Julia, on the other hand, my co-author, works on Platonic metaphysics, and she was interested in this text because she sort of stumbled upon a text ascribed to a woman philosopher she had never heard of before. And I guess in general, what puzzled us was the fact that regardless of who wrote On Wisdom is the first, and to my knowledge, only treatise in Greek antiquity, metaphysical treatise, epistemological treatise in Greek antiquity ascribed to a woman philosopher. And so we thought it deserved more attention.
Thank you. Anna.
All right, thanks, Diane. My subject is Macrina, a 4th century Christian philosopher, so we're jumping ahead in time quite a bit. We happen to know quite a bit about Macrina because we also have a biography about her, which is written by her brother, who may or may not have been a biased source, which is one of the issues I have to deal with. So we do know Macrina is from a large Christian family. She received education. She was also mother taught. And we have some information about that education being in moral theory, particularly using scriptures, but I am tackling in my chapter whether she could have also had access to classical education, like studying the works of Plato, for example. Her family is rather famous. We know that she is the sister of Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Peter of Sebasti. There's some really famous people that she's related to. And it's kind of interesting to think about how Macrina could have influenced them in all of their notoriety. I mean, everybody who has worked in late antiquity encounters Basil the Great's name or Gregory of Nyssa's name. They're not as likely to encounter Macrina's name. But one thing I found as I was researching this figure is that Gregory portrays Macrina as being a teacher. And he uses the phrase "he didaskalos," the teacher, referring to about 22 times in the course of the dialogue on soul and resurrection. So Gregory is referring to Macrina as somebody who's educated, who is able to teach authoritative subjects of the immortality of the soul, the possibility of bodily resurrection, what the soul is like. So the questions of metaphysics as well as religion. And, you know, as for how I got interested in theory, well, a combination of two things. When I started in philosophy and wrote my dissertation, got my first couple publications, it's all been in Plato's theory of death and suicide. So, you know, I'm already interested in questions about dying and about how to live a good life. And somewhere in the course of my study, I encountered this random dialogue by Gregory of Nyssa called On Soul and Resurrection, which some scholars have called a, quote, Christian version of Plato's Phaedo. So I thought, that sounds interesting. Let's dig that text up, see what it is. And lo and behold, there was a woman figure taking on a role that's comparable to Socrates in Plato's Phaedo. So Macrina is actually the one who's teaching Gregory about the nature of the soul and about whether the soul can survive death, whether the body can resurrect. Around the same time I encountered this text, I was teaching my first ancient philosophy course. And I had the student say to me, okay, all this stuff you're teaching is great, it's awesome, but how is it relevant to me? And I realized this was a woman student saying this question. She said a few minutes later, where are the women? Where are the women in this ancient philosophy class? How is this relevant to me, a woman? And I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. But it's just a very embarrassing thing when you're first teaching a class to realize you don't know the answer to a very basic question like, where are the women in the history of philosophy? So these two things happened about the same time. I encountered this text, which is tangentially related to my main area of research. And then I had this question that made me think, oh, maybe I should look into this a little bit more.
Thanks to all of you for those brief glimpses into the process in getting interested in someone's persona and someone's work. Now, when I finished reading the manuscript, I realized I was quite moved by this and really felt that it was a work of memorializing these women. You were all insisting they were there. And I think that in saying that, in memorializing them, you are all insisting that women have their rightful place in intellectual history, and we have to ensure that they continue to have that right. But as many of you have mentioned already, you raise in all of your chapters, you raise the really vexing methodological issues involved in researching ancient women philosophers. The lack of original text, the loss of text, the lack of historical evidence of authorship or text written under pseudonyms and secondhand accounts from men. All of these things are probably very frustrating. Anna, in your chapter, you quote Elizabeth Castelli, remarking that the search for source material is like embarking on a treacherous and often disappointing search for buried treasure. I thought that was quite a marvelous way of putting it. So this must be fascinating for all of you, but also extremely frustrating. So I wonder, how do you respond to this challenge and this frustration, and what keeps you motivated in meeting these challenges? I don't know if everyone wants to respond to this or just some, so I'll leave it up to you. You can wave if you like, or you can just launch into an answer.
Well, I guess I'd just say one thing. If you work in history, I mean, short of, well, of course, there's other ambiguities in Plato. So you just have to accept that at some point you have to make a decision and move on, you know, and allow a certain amount of uncertainty into the process. Because otherwise we can't do anything with any of these figures. And that's not just women, although it is obviously an especially big problem in this area. But obviously the further you go back in time, the more everybody has these kinds of methodological issues. So I think, as I said in my own case, I just say, let's accept the uncertainty and then focus on the audience maybe rather than so much on the speaker.
Katharine.
So I think I have a similar sense to Rosemary, where in the sense that I see it as continuous with the work in history of philosophy in general. So like for those of us who work on pre-Socratic philosophers or like Hellenistic philosophers, we're fairly used to working with fragmentary or indirect or biased evidence. And this is sort of a familiar terrain. And of course, that can be challenging, and depending on tastes, you might also find that sort of fascinating and thrive on that, as I think I probably do. So on the one hand, I think it is not disconnected from familiar work, but on the other hand, I think there are important differences as women. And one of those is that the case of ancient women and the source and methodological issues has long been perceived, I think, as a barrier that like legitimizes our collective failure to engage with their thought. And that is frustrating. So there's the frustration that comes with working on difficult texts. And then there's the frustration of starting to do so and realizing that, you know, the state of our evidence here might be worse, and it might suffer from a compound of these issues, but we don't see the reluctance to take up that kind of task when it comes to reconstructing Empedocles or thinking about Socrates via only indirect and biased evidence, for instance. So I guess that's a place where I still see frustration.
Would you say then that is your motivation, or in part?
In part. So for me, I generally enjoy working on challenging texts. So yeah, a lot of reconstruction is required with other work that I do. But I have actually found that the response I get from students to this work and to this project in particular is very motivating for me. So, you know, like Anna and her students, I guess, I went through 3 philosophy degrees at 3 institutions with very progressive teachers, but never learned anything about an ancient woman philosopher. I didn't know that there were any. And I'm by no means the exception, right? So I've been very moved by the response of students to the inclusion of ancient women in my own teaching. I'm very happy to see some of them here today. And I think we're fortunate that the work of recovering early modern women philosophers is now reasonably advanced to like our great benefit. And students of any gender can have someone like Socrates as a role model, for instance, but there is something special about the sense of belonging that I think is gained by knowing that there were women working in the very first philosophical communities in a number of traditions that we have evidence of, and that's not to be underestimated.
Mm-hmm. Caterina, or sorry, Anna, I wasn't sure. I thought Caterina had something to say.
Anna, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, I think I'm pretty much just adding on to what has been said before me, but you know, my response with methodological issues is that kind of twofold. For one thing, we've got to realize that these methodological questions actually exist, and there's real reasons for why they're existing, and they're important. We got to face them and deal with them. But I'm also tempted to have a totally different attitude towards methodological questions. And that's out of the realization that often methodological questions are used as a way to shut down conversation. It's easy. It's the easy objection we can have to something. I've seen it employed for Socrates and Plato, but I've seen it employed much more frequently and with greater tenacity towards women philosophers. And that's partly because these questions are difficult, if not impossible, to answer in 100% provable fashion. So we've got to be careful when we're dealing with methodological questions that we're not just engaging with them as a way to quickly shut down the conversation and not advance the story that we're trying to tell here. And I guess I would say that that's what keeps me motivated. Like, I want to advance the story. I want to advance the enriching experience of studying philosophy by whatever way I can. And sometimes that's going to mean me saying something like, yeah, this methodological question exists. Yeah, there's not a perfect answer to it, but here's one that could work, and let's go with that and see how far we get.
Caterina.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add I agree with what Rosemary and Katharine have said and about how many of the methodological issues that we come across with women philosophers are sort of on the agenda of a scholar of ancient philosophy on a daily basis. I work on the Pythagorean women, but I also work on the pre-Socratics. So same problems, lack of sources, and people writing about them and biographical materials. So several issues are very similar. I guess, first of all, I would say that this is one of the benefits of working on the women philosophers, because you can't really take the sources for granted, because you have to do all this background work of what are our sources, how can we approach them, what are they reliable, what makes them reliable. These are all skills that we would use anyway in other areas of the field, and that we can implement elsewhere. So in terms of that would be one of my motivations. I wanted to highlight that there are indeed some issues that are a bit more specific to the study of women philosophers, both in terms of the content of the text, sort of what they were meant to philosophize about. In some cases, those source issues are perhaps similar to the ones from the pre-Socratics or Hellenistic philosophers, but slightly more pressing, because for the pre-Socratics, we have some fragments. For most women philosophers, I would say we have no direct evidence at all. So there are difficulties that are peculiar to this study. And that makes it challenging, makes it a bit frustrating sometimes, and in terms of what keeps me motivated, again, I agree with everything that has been said. I guess another thing that I wanted to mention is that, especially for students who are perhaps writing their first philosophy paper, ancient philosophy paper, is that, I mean, it's quite fun to write on texts that are perhaps not new, not completely unknown, but definitely neglected. So when I work on the pre-Socratics and I have a very sort of obscure Heraclitus fragment, there's often a lot of scholarship on that fragment, and that's challenging and interesting for many reasons. But when I turn to Predizione or my Pythagorean women, the scholarship is limited, and that I mean, and so it's fun to work on new materials and materials you haven't read much about. So there's a little bit of freedom going on, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to move to the next question. Your volume really exposes a tension between the desire to view women as philosophers or to view women as women philosophers. And so there's a tension between these. Do we assert them precisely as women philosophers in order to defy those who would say there is no such thing, or do we focus on the fact that they are philosophers? In other words, how much does gender matter? A phrase that I noticed periodically throughout the book captures this tension. In their own right, right? In their own right, it indicates the need to define women as philosophers, but immediately shows that they're in relation to men, because of course we would never have to say that Socrates is a philosopher in his own right. He's entitled to being considered a philosopher. So the question I have is, how much does gender matter in research on ancient women thinkers? And I think there's a couple of different perspectives that appear in the volume. For example, Brian writes that recognizing Sulaba as a woman philosopher not only gives us a fuller appreciation of her own textual and cultural context, but also has the potential to enrich philosophy today. And that was, came out in several of the chapters. But Frisbee Sheffield, who writes on Diotima in Plato's Symposium, she questions why there is so much emphasis in scholarship on Diotima's gender, right? There's a real investment in her being a woman. And Sheffield points out that pregnancy, birth, and midwifery, all featured in the symposium, are not necessarily gendered in this text. Right? She says physical pregnancy is but one species of a much larger phenomenon which covers human creativity of all kinds. So in other words, Plato doesn't use pregnancy or birth metaphorically, and it is contemporary readers who have imposed this reading on the symposium. So is the goal for you all to get to the point when women are considered philosophers rather than women philosophers? Or do we need to maintain gender as a variable in philosophy in general, but also ancient philosophy? Brian.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question. And one of the things I like about the book is how I think that we approach that question differently. I don't think there's like one final answer on this. For me, I think gender is very important. And I think that rather than having it as our goal to have a sort of genderless philosophy, which I think has been this sort of Enlightenment ideal of having this sort of objective, neutral, universal perspective, I think a lot of, for me at least, the most exciting directions of philosophy today is fully sort of, taking on board our subject position, being embodied, being in a, in our own sort of unique web of power relations, et cetera. And I think that in a way, looking at women philosophers helps us move towards maybe a different goal rather than try to, erase gender from, being something that's considered when we look at philosophy.
Anna.
I like what Brian said. I'd like to offer an alternative position, if I may. So I think of this as philosophy as a human discipline. So in the sense that philosophy is asking questions that are essential to us by virtue of our humanity. So it's not just a man's discipline, it's not just a woman's discipline, and it's not going to be entirely different for men or for women. So in that sense, I think philosophy should be for all women, all men. It should just be for all humanity. And that question of gender probably shouldn't raise its head. However, this is a big however, in practice right now, we do have to pay attention to gender. Even at this moment, philosophy has the widest gender disparity of all disciplines in the humanities. As far as other academic disciplines, I think only disciplines like physics and engineering have a worse gender disparity. So gender is important in the discipline right now. Ideally, I wonder if it wouldn't be great if we could focus on philosophy as a human discipline, but realistically, I think given where we're at in society, we have to care about the gender question. I'm sorry, that was a little circuitous, but I think it's something that gets a little bit at the complexity of the question involved.
Rosemary, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I guess in my chapter, what I try to do is argue that attention to these purportedly female figures allows us to enlarge the scope of what can count as a philosophical topic. And in particular, ancient philosophy is very associated with philosophy as a way of life. And if you think about what goes into a life, most of the details are left out in the tradition as we have it. right? Where a lot of tasks are being left to women, to servants. And so to see how those topics could also be subject to philosophical analysis. Now, in the time period, those are gendered and class distributed social roles. And so in that sense, I guess I'm interested in gender as a part of philosophy, but not gender as in its own right? Instead, the parts of life that don't end up getting subject to philosophical analysis when in its own time, women are not considered able to do philosophy. So I think I wouldn't, maybe it's a little polemical to put it this way, maybe I take it back if I have more time to think, but I'm probably not interested in women philosophers as women, but instead as representing ways that philosophy could be more inclusive in general.
Caterina.
One thing I wanted to add was that, again, the question of whether it matters that these are women philosophers is a question that Katharine and I asked ourselves very often when writing our introduction, when planning the volume, because you don't see other volumes about men doing philosophy, and why should we have this label here? And in general, yes, I mean, we're not making any sort of essentially claims about how women do philosophy or did philosophy in antiquity. And we would like them to be included in the canon of ancient philosophers, full stop. But there are, I think, as Brian and Anna and Rosemary highlighted, reasons why gender, I think, matters and will matter. So first of all, there are philosophers, there are thinkers in our volume that write about sort of gendered experiences, or I think in the introduction we call them female-coded experiences. And in that sense, gender is an important part of the equation. And I guess going back to your point about in their own rights, we wouldn't say it about Socrates. That's definitely true. I guess our point was that people tend not to challenge this when it comes to Socrates, which is why we don't feel the need of sort of saying it out loud. Socrates is a philosopher in his own right. Whereas when it comes to women philosophers, often gender is one of the aspects, one of the reasons why they sort of did not receive enough attention in the scholarship. There are other reasons. There is the source problem, and that's definitely very pressing. Because they were sometimes excluded insofar as they were women, we now sort of stress the woman part of the title. And yeah, I think I would be inclined to I mean, I think there are cases in which gender will need to stay there, not because these women philosophized in a specific way because they were women, but perhaps because they philosophized about their own experiences. And so this would be my own.
You put this very well in your introduction, by the way. I just found this quote that I wanted to read. You say, since these figures, these women, were partly disregarded because they were women, it is partly as women that we now propose to reintroduce them in the scholarship. So I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Did you want to add anything, Katharine?
I don't think so. Everyone has spoken eloquently on this, and that really summarizes my thoughts too.
Okay. Some of the comments Rosemary made in response to that question lead us into the next one, which is about the question, what is philosophy and who can be a philosopher, which I think your book really highlights. Sophia Connell, for example, asks, what is encompassed by philosophy? Does knowledge of the body and reproduction count? So she insists in her chapter that women doctors participated as philosophers in classical antiquity. And in Rosemary's discussion of the Pythagorean women, she asks whether the private sphere to which women were relegated is of philosophical interest, and she concludes that it should be. Anne Pang White discusses Ban Zhao, who wrote prolifically, and she is one of from the book, I learned that her writings are one of the few that have survived by women philosophers. She wrote a book called Lessons for Women, and this was intended for women's education. So it instructs women on such issues as mutual respect in marriage, the prevention of domestic abuse, and women's self-cultivation, which includes speaking only when the time is right and bathing regularly, among other things. So I wondered if you could all comment on the inclusion of these sorts of subjects, the private domestic matters and women's embodied experience in philosophical scholarship.
I guess since
Sorry,
my-
Rosemary, go ahead.
I guess since my chapter is on it, I should definitely jump in here. Yeah, I think, there's obviously very interesting issues that arise having to do, the texts that I look at deal mostly with one's own character and self-presentation in terms of modesty and also dealing with one's husband and not so much child rearing. But there are other texts, obviously, that I could have dealt with that dealt much more with child rearing. And you can see quite obviously how that would have a big impact on the city as a whole, right? And so these are important things to think about philosophically. I think the texts that I discuss, and I sort of try to connect them in ways that you might be able to use pedagogically in a classroom with both Aristotle's Politics and Plato's Tripartite Soul. And you can see how one could make, these are instances of philosophically structured arguments about these topics. Here's a conclusion, I'll give you premises that get you to that conclusion. And so I think it's quite clear from the works that some of us are considering that it's certainly possible to treat them philosophically. The important thing is to keep bringing up, as you say, the way you phrased my question, that women are relegated to, right? You don't want to somehow start essentializing and sounding like, oh, these are interesting. This is women's philosophy. This is the stuff that women could care about, right? But as a matter of historical, possibly contingent, but anyway, historical fact, these are relegated to women's responsibilities. And so to find them being discussed, you're going to have to look at philosophy either by or at least for women.
Mm-hmm. And we still have to deal with this question, right? I had an MA student a couple of years ago who was involved in a panel on women in philosophy, and she said that she called it the tender subjects, that when we deal with certain subjects in philosophy, they're considered tender. They're considered to be the subject matter that only women should be interested in. So it's not just a question of looking back historically. Did someone else want? Katharine, go ahead.
Yeah, just to say, in my work on arete, this comes up in the context of thinking about whether the Cyrenaics have particular reasons or justifications for thinking that early childhood education and even caring responsibilities and nurture responsibilities that would be unique to a mother teacher or to mothers in general would be advantageous for a school that is focused on bringing their followers into a way of life and not just an intellectual way of life. So a kind of challenge to, this is like an interesting point, a point of focus for Plato and Aristotle's early childhood education, but there's not as much of an emphasis on what role is particularly gendered there in terms of the access that a mother has and the continuity to the access a mother has to their children. So I think about that in the context of that chapter. But generally, I think one of the most interesting outcomes of the book as a whole, and work on ancient women generally in the philosophical arena, is that it does force this reevaluation of things like the proper domain of philosophy, right? Because like the idea of philosophy as a way of life has been sort of a big contemporary issue in scholarship from Pierre Hadot onward, and there's lots of good work on it. But it's generally just assumed that either means like public displays of one's philosophical commitments or philosophically informed activities where male paradigms have totally determined what those are. And work like Rosemary's and Anne Pang White on Banshao, work on Hipparchia, Sophia Connell's work on women doctors, for instance, I think challenge us to consider the domestic sphere as a credible domain for philosophical reflection, to consider women and other genders and bodies of life as a philosophical topic. So for me, that has been one of the areas that I would point to when I think about what does this kind of work offer, not just to those interested in ancient women, but to those interested in these broader questions in ancient philosophy and contemporary philosophy.
Anyone have anything further to add on this? I'm going to take this to continue in this direction, to think about the term gatekeeping. Because the question that I just asked really throws into stark relief the work of gatekeeping that's not innocent, gatekeeping of philosophy. Interests are at stake, particular interests are at stake in excluding women from philosophy. So I have a number of questions that follow from this. First, your research makes clear that women were active participants in the intellectual life of their times, right? They were said to have taught and challenged male philosophers. And I loved the story of Sulaba challenging King, is it Janaka, yeah. Janaka, yes. And Diotima challenged in the symposium, she was said to have taught Socrates about love. Arete, Macrina, they're also really excellent examples. Brian points out in the Upanishads that there are some very notable women there in that text discussing philosophical issues. And you also note that since the authorship of the Mahabharata is in question, there may have been female authors in that text as well. Katharine, Anna, and Jana Schultz write about women who directed philosophical schools, Arete, Macrina, and Hypatia. And Banzhao was so accomplished, this quite impressed me, was so accomplished that the Chinese emperor summoned her to tutor the empresses and royal consorts, and she also participated in state affairs. So they were there very clearly, and yet they've been erased in subsequent philosophical history. So this, I think, is interesting because the evidence is there that they were active in their times and they were acknowledged by male philosophers, but since then they have been erased. Never mentioned in all but a few courageous philosophy courses, right, in university classes. And this gives us the impression that there were no ancient women philosophers. So I wonder if you would comment on possible reasons for this subsequent erasure. Maybe you have ideas about that.
Do you want a list?
Yeah, yes, go ahead, Anna.
I mean, there's of course the nefarious possibility that it's by design, that women's intellectual history has been purposefully shunted to the side. That's a possibility. There's a possibility that human social evolution has made it so that women have had less chance to engage actively in mental exercise from the get-go. So there's fewer examples we can reply to. There's the influence of religion that could be a factor here. Other folks could probably speak more about that than I can. But there's also the possibility of plain dumb bad luck. So in the course of my research, I encountered a story of a 14th century Common Era manuscript that's collected in the Vatican, and it is a scribe's reporting of the letters that he had copied by the Pythagorean woman Theano. And in the margins or the heading of this copying of the Pythagorean woman's letters, he wrote, "I have copied these letters, but I have chosen not to copy the letters by Holy Macrina because of the interval of time that had passed between Theano and Macrina. It was about 10 centuries at that point. So we know that Macrina had some writings that survived up until the 14th century, but through this particular accident, the scribe says, never mind, I'm not going to copy Macrina's letters. But we know they were existing then, but this scribe made the choice not to copy it. His reasons may have been perfectly legitimate. 10 centuries is a good gap of time between Theano and Macrina. But the fact is, through decisions like that, many, many small decisions like that over time, we've lost so much. And
Mhm.
I think we can read into that a lot of different things. Some of it's not just nefarious, some of it's just accidental.
Katharine?
So I'll say something about Arete first, because with her, I'm a little bit cautious about speculating about reasons for erasure, in part because I think it's a live possibility that her work was mostly preservation of her father's thought, translation of that to her son. And it's unfortunate that her independent philosophical contribution, even in that sense, isn't preserved. But I think it's also might speak more to our contemporary prejudice for highlighting independent, novel, original thought. Whereas, in the ancient world, it was just as valuable, if not more valuable, to be a conservator of someone's thought. Jana Schultz makes this point regarding Hypatia's importance as a preserver of the legacy of Plato. So in part, I'm always tempted to think that sexism plays a role in the way that the sources reproduce her and highlight her role as legitimizing her son and as a mother. But with the sort of individual case, I'm, less moved to make a strong claim. But then I think when we step back and think about the state of our evidence for ancient women generally, I think the response can be different. Because it's hard to overstate the challenge we face regarding the sources for ancient philosophical thought. So in the Greek and Roman tradition, there is not a single surviving text that is incontestably ascribed to a woman philosopher. And some respond to that by saying, well, look, doxographical sources like Diogenes are full of lists of lost works by male philosophers. And so we shouldn't be surprised that there are so many works by women that fail to survive. They're after all still a minority, of course, even with the positions that some of them held. But when we look across the oeuvre generally, I think we should still be shocked at how little evidence of their thought is available to us. And to dismiss that worry too quickly by pointing out that the works of men are also missing, or the state of evidence in general, it can be quite bad, prevents us from inquiring further into those historical and cultural forces that would have resulted in the current loss. And I think it's very important with a book like this that we're optimistic about what we can do and the value that it has, but that we don't downplay what is lost and the importance of reflecting on that. And I think those reflections ought to be contextual and sociological in a way, relative to the particular figure, and thinking about ways in which they might be erased or biased in the ancient sources as versus contemporary treatments, which can also be biased. But this is we just tried to be honest with this in the book, put this on the page. And that, I think, it becomes great in teaching context, because even just raising that as an issue, I have found to be a very fruitful way of engaging with this material with students.
Brian?
Yeah, in some ways, I'm amazed that Sulabha is in the Mahabharata. That this is one of the central religious narrative, mythological texts of an entire culture. And of course, she's in some very short episode in this vast text. But on the other hand, that episode's preserved in almost every single manuscript across India. So, that was considered an important episode that could not be left out of that. So I think that's interesting to look at from another angle as well. And also that another thing, a text like the Mahabharata is, some of the most sexist and misogynist statements you're ever going to see anywhere are in the Mahabharata. But then some of the most, progressive female characters from ancient India are also in this text, challenging those very stereotypes along the way. So what I see that, I don't know how to understand it completely in terms of erasure, but I do see in terms of, in terms of gatekeeping, but somehow they made it inside the gate. And, here's a text where there's a conversation going on, some of the conversation being quite, saying quite misogynist things, but then an answer to that, critiquing that view. And again, as I was saying, not just Sulaba with those views, but a number of very prominent female characters.
You've just given a great segue into my next question, which is to think more carefully about the role of misogyny. Some of your chapters really illuminate this quite well. The threat of women's intellectual authority and expertise and achievements, right? This threat has been there throughout history. We could talk about the threat still being present in philosophy, which is why gatekeeping is considered necessary. So attention is drawn in some chapters to the implicit or explicit misogyny of male philosophers. Sulaba dares to challenge King, I keep forgetting how to pronounce his name, Janaka,
yeah.
And emerges victorious in the debate, and he resorts to insults. Kelly Aronson had a very interesting chapter in your volume that discusses women Epicureans who may have been both philosophers and sex workers, and they dared to challenge their male counterparts. Of course, their sexual status was used to ridicule them. They were considered to stain philosophy, as she puts it in her chapter. Aronson writes that the accounts of Epicurean women all follow a similar pattern. Quote, the authors aim to undermine and mock Epicurean hedonism by sexualizing accounts of its practitioners. So the Epicurean women are ridiculed and their interactions with the school's men are sensationalized. So I wondered, after I read that chapter, does this get at the heart of the problem for women philosophers throughout the ages? That women's identity as sexual or sexualizable persons is simply incompatible with intellectual brilliance, right? Women cannot be tolerated as intellectual authorities. I wonder how you'd respond to that. And then I have a couple of other questions related. Rosemary.
Yeah, I mean, the situation, at least in Attic Greece, is more complicated than that. Because, women wives were relegated to a separate part of the house. They couldn't leave if they were respectable women without servants. They didn't really have relationships with their husbands, such as to have these kinds of conversations. So there are figures, like another figure that could have been in the book, Aspasia, who is Pericles' partner and also supposed to be a prostitute, who, at least whether joking or not, Plato says she composed Pericles' funeral speech, and she was definitely well regarded as a talker and a thinker at the time. And so there were kinds of conversations I suppose you could have with consorts and people like that you wouldn't have with the overly virginalized, modest wife that you have. And so I think misogyny cuts in both directions, right? It's not just that, certainly you can, point out that however brilliant Aspasia is, she's still a prostitute, or however brilliant these Epicurean women are, they're still prostitutes. And that works in misogyny to undermine them in some way. But the flip side of that, if you want to have like the Madonna whore complex, is not a better, I think, position for women to find themselves in, as far as whether they're going to be regarded as the people who have intellectual contributions to make.
Anna.
So my woman, Macrina, is an interesting example of just what you're asking about in this question. She is portrayed as being a teacher of men and women, drew them to the study of philosophy, it says over and over and over again. However, Gregory, while writing this story, has to emphasize some really strange fact about her. He says she was so brilliant that she, quote, hardly qualified as a woman. And to me, that really epitomizes exactly the issue we're talking about here, because it's like she's clearly being portrayed as going above and beyond the weaknesses of her sex. And that's seen as astounding. And I don't know exactly how Gregory is viewing it, but it's almost like he's putting this fact of her womanhood to the side and emphasizing just her humanity. We see other things like this throughout the writings. She is portrayed as teaching, she's portrayed as gesturing and speaking loudly like a man. At one time after, this is in the life of Macrina, so the biography about her, Gregory says that after Macrina had died, one of the women living in the house had pulled us down Macrina's gown and showed Macrina's breast to Gregory. And there was a mark on the breast. So Gregory actually doesn't even really notice the breast. He just notices the mark on the breast and talks about the significance of this mark as marking her out from among humans for some sort of special service to God, or marking her for her abilities as a philosopher. So it's like she's being portrayed as going above her womanhood.
Brian.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things pertaining to this issue that I think is so interesting about the Sulaba episode is she really turns that misogyny, especially the tendency for male philosophers to sexualize women, on its head, because like that's exactly, Jonica's biggest flaw is he can't engage with her philosophically, and he keeps on commenting on her age and her beauty and her appearance and this sort of thing. And she, the argument that she develops is basically that he cannot possibly have achieved moksha if he is acting in that way. And so, that I think that's one of the beautiful things about this whole episode is that, it takes this thing that we, this situation that we find far too often, but then really turns it around and, says that it, it's not what the women that are like that it's the problem. It's really a limit to the man's perspective to be able to recognize her, philosophical brilliance or whatever.
I'm so struck by how relevant all of this is still for us today. It's rather discouraging. Any other comments to that question? I would like to know what you think is the appropriate response to philosophical gatekeeping in general, and not only on the part of men, because women are certainly can be fierce defenders of a very narrow male-defined canon. Do you have any thoughts on that, Caterina?
Katharine and I yesterday thought about this question a lot. We really liked your question about gatekeeping, and we were sort of really thinking about this quite a lot yesterday. So in terms of proper responses to responses to gatekeeping, one thing that I thought is that perhaps, so sometimes the feeling that I have is that the reason behind gatekeeping is a sort of assumption that including women in the philosophical canon means kicking someone else out. Mm-hmm. And so teaching Epicurean women philosophers would be not teaching Cicero or something along these lines. And we don't want to do that. And so that might generate the reaction of the gatekeeping. Okay, so we keep Cicero in, we keep Thales in, we keep the pre-Socratics and leave someone else's out. So I guess the first reaction that I would have is just to say that there's no, I mean, the philosophical canon luckily doesn't really have limited seats. I mean, it's up to us to decide how many thinkers we include when it comes to ancient philosophy. I also see that a possible reaction to this would be to say that perhaps maybe not the canon, but when we think of a curriculum, like which philosophers do you teach? Well, that does have limited seats because you only have limited weeks in a term, and then so in that sense, if we include Macrina, we might a lecture on Macrina, we might need to skip someone else, and so in that sense, a possible sort of response or attitude would be just to be very honest about the fact that every time we think of a canon or we think of a curriculum, we are making a selection. And so we could wonder, we could just be honest, just acknowledge that we're making a selection, acknowledge that there are people who we're leaving out for certain reasons, and then so just be honest about that in general. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that the reason why we liked your gatekeeping question is that another very useful thing is to keep being sort of mindful about the kind of gatekeeping that you yourself might be doing. So we have this book on women philosophers that is far from comprehensive. There's so many more women philosophers. Some have been mentioned already, Aspasia, Hipparchia, that are unfortunately not in the volume. We wanted to include women from sort of outside the Greek and Roman philosophical traditions, and we only have 3 chapters that deal with this. So, I mean, I guess a good exercise is to keep the gatekeeping thread open and see where you're making it yourself.
Brian.
Yeah, I mean, as one of the contributors who's, working with material outside of the, in the Western tradition, I feel like I'm sort of confronting this issue of gatekeeping in this sort of double way, not only looking at women philosophers, but looking at a whole philosophical tradition of, more than 2,000 years that has tended to be left out of Western curriculums. From my point of view, and I'd be happy to talk about this in far more detail at another time, but I think those gates should just come crashing down. I think there's too many things that are not being included because of this very, in my mind, outdated and way of seeing the history of philosophy, one that has all sorts of colonial resonances and other problems. So yeah, let's crash down the gates as far as I'm concerned.
You've drifted into my last question, so let's just if the rest of you want to respond to either of these, gatekeeping in terms of gender or gatekeeping in terms of the Western entitlement to the origins of philosophy or the canon in philosophy, either of these, and we could spend much more time, I'm sure, on this question, especially this last one, but let's do the best we can here. Katharine.
Yeah, I'll add something. I agree with everything that's been said. And I guess one way that I've been thinking about this is to offer a kind of open philosophical response that attends to, becoming more aware of our own biases. Like, we're all taught a canon. We know that there is a cognitive bias that leads us to value the familiar and defend the familiar. And I think it can be helpful to shift the conversation from all that we'll lose if we start including new figures and expanding and disrupting the canon and the difficulties of deciding what not to cover, to what we gain and what we're missing out on if we don't discuss these figures. I think we've all tried in our respective chapters to articulate what we think is to be gained by including ancient women in these particular figures, so that this can be weighed by each person against their other competing priorities. So I guess that's my sort of general sense of how we make progress on this. I mean, I guess the other thing to say is that the material from ancient women isn't too much of a threat because there still isn't very much. So we're not going to have to jettison Plato and Aristotle to do this. Do we read a 6th Platonic dialogue, or do we think about it's not too much of a threat to include a few voices here.
Yes, but unfortunately, it's so much more than just those fragments. It's an entire history of women who are being ignored. I find your responses really interesting, but I think that the challenge is persuading those for whom the canon is kind of sacred. Right. I mean, Brian, you said you wanted to let's just explode this, but but for many that it's a sacred cow. Rosemary.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, my initial reaction to your question was sort of not worrying about gatekeeping gatekeepers, you know? So if people want to gatekeep, I don't know, let them do so. They're sort of like a dying breed at this point, I think. And then the solution is lots of volumes like this. Another one that is much more Eastern focused and has 2 chapters on Greek or Roman women. And, you know, and if people don't want to read it or say it's not philosophy, then you just don't listen to those people. But at the same time, of course, you know, there are people who are entirely unfamiliar with any of the literature, and so you can persuade them by exposing them to it. But if someone is just going to insist, then I would just ignore them personally.
But as Caterina pointed out, this affects how we teach philosophy, so we would have to think about what is it, who should the students be exposed to, and if there is a limit, right, 10 philosophers, then what do we do? How do we respond to that gatekeeping in the classroom? And the same goes for all the different traditions, right? How do we make room for other traditions besides the Greek? Any last thoughts on this before I open it up to Q&A? Katharine?
I mean, I'll just say one thing, which is that like Caterina and I work principally in Greek and Roman philosophy. And so for us, it was like this interesting challenge to include and work closely with contributors who are working in Indian and Chinese. And with respect to Peter Adamson's thoughts about women in the Islamic tradition. I mean, I think generally working on ancient women has raised our awareness of othering in other ways. But it's been interesting to see that the solution to one of the big problems of lack of source material on ancient women is in a part solved by greater inclusivity of non-Western traditions. I mean, the rich sources that we have in the Indian tradition, in the Chinese tradition, Murasaki in the Japanese tradition, these are some of the best preserved texts that we have. So in terms of reasons to be open-minded when it comes to that kind of inclusivity, well, there's a big dividend there, I think. So yeah, I mean, you can see what side of this debate I fall on, and I hope we just try to present a good case that will get people interested in this material, not only for its internal interest, but for the way that it enriches our conversation about the canon, about the history of philosophy, about what we're doing as a discipline then and now.
Yes, Anna.
So I might even add to this that we can use people's infatuation with the Western tradition to our benefit as we argue for this. So Socrates is famous for saying, hey, the only thing I know is that I know nothing, right? So why do we think that we can only go to Western philosophy or the quote unquote greats to get some enlightenment on learning to know a little bit more than nothing? Shouldn't we, if we're following in the footsteps of Socrates, be willing to go beyond that? I guess that's all I have to say on that.
That's a marvelous way to end the round table part of this. Thank you very much for your very thoughtful responses to all my questions. I'm going to stop the recording